Hi everyone, Dr. Palmer here. Today's lecture involves Ruth Benedict and looking at her Patterns of Culture, which was written in 1934. Although it was written quite some time ago, nearly 100 years ago, her work is still very relevant today in looking at our current contemporary society in the United States, as well as the global society and different cultures within the global realm. So join me on this journey. As with all the lectures, I provide a list of vocabulary for you guys to focus on and draw your attention. These are things that I find important, that are important in anthropology when you're studying it. And you might find things that are a little bit more of interest to you, and that is fine. Just remember that these might be some things that appear on quizzes or tests. As with any material that is provided in this course, I do my best to give you questions to read beforehand so that it can guide your process of the information. I will refrain from reading these dozen questions. I suggest you skim them very quickly, and this will help guide you so that you can follow along with the lecture and also the readings. So without further ado, I will address most of these, if not all of them, throughout the rest of this lecture. Before we begin talking about patterns of culture, I think it's important to understand who the author is. So just some facts about Ruth Benedict. She was born in New York City in 1887. She attended Vassar College and graduated in 1909, so quite a long time ago, over 100 years ago. She received her PhD from Columbia University in New York City in 1923, and she was a student of Franz Boas, who is considered in American anthropology to be the father of modern-day anthropology. She is rumored to have had an affair with Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was another student of Boas's. She is also one of the most popular anthropologists of her time, and she was popular basically because she studied adolescent sexual behavior among the Polynesian Samoans specifically, and her work became very popular in, outside of academia because of the content and the revelations that she gave with regard to sexual freedom in adolescence of American Samoa. Anyway, back to Ruth Benedict. In 1995, there was a U.S. stamp that was created in her honor, and it was worth 46 cents back then. I think stamps are now 50 cents or so in 2021. I don't know how many people use stamps, but they're great artwork. All right, let's move on. So patterns of culture is an example of kind of armchair anthropology. So this is the type of anthropology that was done in the beginning of the field's beginning, where you had learned men who would be sitting in an armchair. I have arms, you just can't see them, but they would sit in an armchair. They would gather information and material resources, material culture from various travelers, and they would compare and contrast with the items that they found or that they were provided with, and they would also compare and contrast the items of their own cultures, and they would come up with theories. So in this same kind of tradition, Ruth Benedict, in her Patterns of Culture, uses 3 different ethnographies for her theorization of patterns of culture and looking for those patterns of culture. So the first is she looked at Dr. Ruth L. Bunzel's study on the Zuni people in the Southwest of the Americas. And then she looked at Dr. Rio Fortune's ethnography on the Dobu in the South Pacific. And finally, she used her own mentor, Dr. Franz Boas's studies on the Kwakiutl people who lived in live in the Pacific Northwest. The picture to the left shows an image of Dr. Franz Boas performing or modeling one of the dance moves from one of the Kwakiutl ceremonies. So the introduction of Patterns of Culture is actually written by Franz Boas, hence me bringing him up. But what it did is Franz Boas laid out the critique of human studies. So anthropology is the study of human beings, anthrop meaning human beings, and ology meaning studies. And so Franz Boas looks at how the old method of constructing history of human culture was based on little bits of evidence torn out of their natural contacts and collected from all times and parts of the world. And they were supplemented by archaeological evidence. Again, this was done by armchair anthropologists, such as Sir E.B. Tyler, which I'll talk about in a moment. And with that said, the attempts to connect different groups to each other based on the material culture that kind of had a similar look, or the actual materials that were being made from. So like, oh, these people made things from wood. Yeah, they made things from wood because that's all they had available. They didn't have stone. They didn't necessarily have iron. Or, hey, these groups created bronze pieces, and so they must be related to these other groups that live in the other side of the world because they use the same material, which was not necessarily true. Anyway, this foundation, this evolutionary method of observing culture, was started by Sir E.B. Tyler and was looked in a little bit deeper by Lewis Henry Morgan. And basically what both of these scholars did was they grouped people and cultures according to how complex their material culture was, their societies were, their legal, agricultural, or food gathering practices were, their mating rituals, all sorts of things like that. And so Sir E.B. Tyler came up with the divisions of savage, barbarian, and civilized. So savage people were hunter-gatherers, barbarian people were people that had structures, they had art, they had material cultural items that were more resilient to the test of time. And then finally you had civilized, which was, hey, you guessed it, or if you didn't guess it, the industrial people of Europe. Again, Sir E.B. Tyler, or maybe not again, but just FYI, Sir E.B. Tyler was a British man, and he's writing in like the 1830s during the height of the Industrial Revolution, where lots of things were going on, a lot of technology was being constructed and built, and because of that technology, they could build bigger, better, faster things. And this was supposedly the pinnacle of civilization, right? What Lewis Henry Morgan did, and Lewis Henry Morgan was actually a New Yorker who studied with the Iroquois, and it gave him a little bit more insight into the complexity of so-called primitive or savage people. And so he didn't totally get rid of the term savage, but what he did was make it a little bit more specific. So yes, there were still savages, but within those savages, you had low, middle, and high savages. People that he was working with, more specifically, the Seneca of New York State, they were considered to be high savages because they had very complex legal systems, they had very complex kinship systems, they had a high aesthetic, and yeah, there was just a lot of things that were going on in their culture that was different from, let's say, Khoisan in South Africa, an indigenous group of people who were hunter-gatherers and were nomadic, right? They didn't live in one spot. Because they were hunter-gatherers, they moved around. And then you have barbarians, so high, middle, low, or sorry, low, middle, high barbarians. The people in the barbarian category, they all had language. They maybe some had written, and those would be the high barbarians, and some didn't have, they just were oral. And therefore they were low barbarians. However, their aesthetic, their legal systems, the material from which they built their structures and their art with was more strong to, again, withstand the test of time. And then finally, you have the civilized people. And so what Franz Boas is doing in this introduction is saying, this is the foundation, and we're not going to sugarcoat it. We're making you aware that this is what anthropology started out with, but in our modern day anthropology, we look at new methods to observe human beings, and we want to understand cultures within their totality and their own context, rather than comparing apples with oranges. It's really easy to compare a person's smartness with a squirrel's smartness, let's say. But when we look at the context of the life of a squirrel who runs around and collects nuts and then hides them, and then we look at the context of the life of a human being, where we're more creative, we're more communicative, we're more social creatures than maybe squirrels are. So when we compare our smartness of communicating with the smartness of a squirrel, you're comparing two completely different things, because it's hard for a human being to park a car and then come out and find your car unless you're doing it in the same spot every time. But it's way easy for a squirrel to, bury their nuts and then find it, like months later, because that's their programming. So yeah, kind of weird that I made that comparison. But if anyone wants to know more about, animals and how smart they are, there's an awesome book called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And it's a great book, and it gives you a different perspective on the intelligence and how maybe human beings have evolved in their intelligence and how other animals have evolved. And, it just gives you a more maybe compassionate aspect and vision of all living life and their ways of being. So one of the interesting carryovers that you might see the Sir E.B. Tyler and his, disciplinary descendant, Lewis Henry Morgan, their idea of savage, barbarian, and civilized is going into like a national museum, like the Field Museum in Chicago or the Museum of Natural History in New York City, or even the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When we go into those areas, oftentimes you'll see work is classified. Even university museums do the same thing. the Indiana University Art Museum, where I went to school, not at the museum, but I did my graduate training at Indiana University. The art museum there did the same thing that the Metropolitan Museum of Art did, and the Museum of Natural History and the Field Museum in Chicago did. Basically, items from Polynesia and Africa, and maybe sometimes indigenous North America, they were all grouped in a similar area because they were all made out of wood, and so early cultural observers and scholars looked at the things and were like, hey, they look similar. The items might have similar aesthetic with the abstractness of the art. And so again, that to these early cultural observers was grouped together and therefore displayed in museums in the same way. And if you go throughout the museums, you can see like the Egyptians and if there's any like Byzantine era or Babylonian era artifacts or ancient Greek artifacts, they will be within that same area displayed because the material is similar, and therefore the art is a little bit more similar to each other than the artwork of the Polynesia or the Americas or Africa. So it's not necessarily that there was cultural contact between them. However, because they share the same material, like actual hard, hey, this is porcelain, that's porcelain. Oh, they must be related. They must have had some cultural sharing. Not necessarily true. But we can see these early ideas of this evolutionary continuum even within the museums. And so that is part of the reason why the decolonization of museums, such as, let's say, the Museum of Natural History within New York City, and tearing down the statue of Teddy Roosevelt is just kind of like a saving face, because you still have a lot of work to do within the museums. So one of the things Benedict does is look at the individual and place them within their culture, and shows how they, as an individual, are reflective of their culture. So she looked at social psychology, which in her words, she says, reveals the dynamic processes active in cultural changes and enables us to evaluate evidence obtained from detailed comparison of related cultures. She writes in order to get anyone who's reading her book to understand that culture is lived by the individual, and without the individual there would be no culture. And she asks us to consider the individual as a product of his or her culture. And I urge every one of you that is watching this to think about your own culture and see how you are reflected, how your culture is reflected not only in your actions, but how you dress, maybe how you interact with other people. And note that, if maybe you were born somewhere else, you might have a different way of performing your culture. So the way you have body language, the words that you choose, even your thought processes, what you think is right and wrong. Another thing that Benedict brings up is this idea of genius of culture. And genius of culture, quote, end quote, is a knowledge of the attributes controlling individual and group behavior. So think about yourself as an individual, regardless of your gender, race, religion, and think about how maybe if you were born in a totally different place, halfway across the world, how that culture might influence your actions. So there's lots of terms and words that we can pick out in this reading, but one of the most important within anthropology is this idea of functionalism. And basically what functionalism does is it's a theory that looks at different elements within culture and looks at how they function. So the main theorists within anthropology are Herbert Spencer, Emile Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, and Robert Merton. Functional anthropologists, again, focus on how particular cultural items function in a specific society. So the idea that society is a system of interconnected parts that work together in harmony to maintain a state of balance and social equilibrium for the whole is very important within this theoretical framework. And Benedict points out that for functionalists, society is like a living organism. So the reproductive system is representative of kinship systems, and not all kinship systems are universal. As Lewis Henry Morgan pointed out for anthropologists, Iroquois society are matrilineal, and they are also matriarchal. So women are held at the head of society. The line is passed down, and property is passed down, and clans also are passed down through the mother's line, and fathers are just kind of, if you will, sperm donors. What we call fathers in Western society, because Western society is a patriarchal and patrilineal society. There are some changes. However, patriarchal, the father is the head of the household. The father's name passes down, that's patrilineal, and property passes down. Now, within contemporary Western society, you might say, well, hey, if my mom was a single mom and she's the one where I get all my my inheritance from, or she's the one where I get my surname from, my last name from, or my mother's eldest brother is like my father figure, then you might align your kinship system with a matriarchal system. If you have both parents in the picture and, like one, you're kind of equal, mother and father, both males and females can hold same positions of hierarchy, they can both inherit and they can both pass down things, then you're more of a unilineal system, which is, and nothing is wrong or right or good or bad about either system. It's just, these are different systems, right? Back to this idea of functionalism, you have religion being the circulatory system, which carries ideas and thoughts about what is right and wrong to the heart and brain, if you will, and that varies, right? Some groups consider that there are only male and female genders, and marriage should only be between of opposite genders, male and female. Other religious systems see marriage as like anyone can marry. They marry for love and for there's nothing wrong with being homosexual or heterosexual because it is part of what makes us human, and we're all God's creatures, right? I digress. The digestive system would be the economics, so what we consume and what we produce, right? That's basic economics, supply and demand. And then finally, the nervous system, which gets everybody nervous, is the politics, how we govern, how we create our hierarchy systems that are outside of the kinship system. Sometimes these things are very interrelated, and sometimes these things are more separated. It really depends on the culture that you're looking at. And we'll examine and look at more specifics, but this is basically the foundation of one of the ways that anthropology looks at culture. So when we study culture, we also want to look at custom. The reason why an anthropologist looks at custom is because it helps us understand how culture changes over time. In order to do this, we want to look at customs in a non-judgmental way. And we want to figure out how people have used the different ways of doing things to deal with daily human problems that we encounter, or just lifetime human problems, right? And in so, we understand that custom is a part of culture, and it's an expression of and mass of detailed behavior as dictated by the norms and morals of the culture. So it's more than just an individual's actions. We have to look at the individual and understand where they're coming from and what customs that they're bringing, or what aspect of culture they are bringing through their customs, right, through their practices. And most important, we want to see is the role custom plays in the experiences and beliefs of a people. And when I say people, we're talking about an ethnic group, right? A people that share the same cultural practices. And we want to understand how those customs manifest. And then with this knowledge, we understand that all people have biases based on the set of customs they practice and the cultural institutions for which they belong. So Benedict points out that individuals are nurtured by their cultures and thus are products of their culture. And sometimes they are reactions to their culture. So if we look at protesting, from an anthropological point of view, there was a lot of protests in 2020 and even into the beginning of 2021. And there were two separate groups that they were all Americans, but they were protesting for different reasons, right? So when we look at the United States as an example, we want to examine, all right, what in our American culture says that it's okay for a whole mass of people to get together during a pandemic? Well, the First Amendment, right? Our common belief as Americans that the Constitution and the amendments, the First Amendment specifically, allow us freedom of speech and the right to gather and freedom of belief, right? And so that's one part of our culture, this material document, right, that we've all agreed on. This is what partly makes us American. The second point is that throughout our American history, it has been rife with revolution and rebellions. And so picking up on that, protesters for the summer Black Lives Matter, as well as the insurrectionists in January 6, 2021, they were both exercising their rights to rise up, mass, speak their piece, and then sometimes it gets out of hand and they take action, as we saw with the violence that occurred in the summertime and the destruction of property, and we saw violence and destruction of property happen at the Capitol building as well. So now looking at this from a non-judgmental anthropological viewpoint, we see, oh, okay, so this is what made these individuals kind of gather. You know, we have a document that protects their rights. We have this idea of freedom, and this idea that all the Constitution and the idea of America protects all people. And when we as individuals collect together and express our distaste for injustice, because all of those people, regardless if you're in the Black Lives Matter or the insurrectionists, they all felt that they were being wronged in some way. Therefore, they took to the streets and they took to their rights, right? We're able to take a step back and understand this is how things get out of hand, or maybe this is maybe where we can do better, right, and serve for justice for all people and instead of just a few, right? And so that's why it's important to look at these ideas behind what people actually do and the person within the culture. All right, moving right along, science and objectivity. So one of the things that Benedict does is she's proving that anthropology is a science that requires objectivity. And she states on page 18, no preferential weighting of one or another of the items in the series it selects for its consideration will be used in anthropology as a science. So in other words, if we're looking at our modern contemporary society and culture, I am not valuing this pen over this mouse, which both I use to communicate in various ways. I'm looking at how me as an individual within my culture uses both of these things to communicate to others within my culture. So another idea that is super duper important is this idea of ethnocentrism, which is the belief that one's culture is better than all others. So let's take America, for instance, USA, USA, people chanting that, and people in their own little bubble thinking that what they care about is the most important thing, and not empathizing and being compassionate and looking outside, that there are other groups that might value other things more than what we value, and thinking, no, they're wrong, but I'm right. So anthropology tries to actually fight against ethnocentrism by showing that we do have individuals, and they express their culture through the customs and the daily things that they do. There's nothing wrong or right about it. It just is, because that is how that human was brought up, right? And so we, as anthropologists, try to look at human beings in their own context and cultures within their own context, rather than comparing. Because the old way of doing things was giving preferential treatment to one's group and showing and trying to prove the superiority of that, the member's own group. So if we look back to Sir E.B. Tyler and his studies, him being a British man of the industrial society, was looking at all other cultures in comparison to the complexity of his own culture in this Victorian age that he was born into and that he was raised into. The sun never set on the British Empire, right? Because they had colonies all across the world, right? So Asia, down to the tip of Africa and into the Americas, right? Or the Caribbean at the very least. And so that's a pretty big, you should have a pretty big ego about your nation, right? And so him also being of this time where technology was really coming to height, and there was a very big difference between England and where they were technologically, their academics, their economies, their production, right, is very different from a lot of places, let's say in Southern Africa, because they were relatively, or New Zealand, let's say, because they were relatively early or late within colonization, 1800s by England. they were encountering people that were, let's say, quote unquote, more simple, right? They didn't have all the machines that England had. And therefore, from an ethnocentric point of view, Sir E.B. Tyler was trying to prove that his culture was unique, right? And superior to all of those other cultures that they were encountering that didn't have, coal machines, steam engines, mass production of material culture. And so, but this harkens back to the Judeo-Christian tradition that man is the center of the universe, right? Because man is created in God's own image, Adam, right? Women are created from the rib of Adam, and therefore human beings are unique. And we'll get into more of a discussion how race plays into this and how religion plays into this. But if we look at the history of science, this idea of a heliocentric universe where the Earth revolves around the sun actually goes counter to the narrative that Earth is unique because God created it, and it's special, and men are special, or human beings are special, and everything else kind of falls into line underneath it, right? Or revolves around this idea of human beings are at the center and they're the most important things, right? The Earth is most important. And actually the idea of heliocentrism ran counter to the Bible. And Copernicus challenged Christian philosophy and was charged as a heretic, right? We also look at Charles Darwin and this idea of evolution, right? That everybody kind of misidentifies the fact that human beings evolved out of a one-celled organism, and so that is where, and then from all this changes in the atmosphere and changes within the species and mutations within cells, we get to human beings, which runs counter to this idea of the human soul and the human being being a reflection of God's divinity, right? If you look at it in a different way, more like maybe what Darwin might have been thinking, that you have a creature, whether it be a one-celled organism or a multi-celled organism, such as humans, and depending on their environment, they evolve, they change and adapt based on their surroundings, and based on who gets to procreate and reproduce, and the love and care and attention that they get. That is how people change. That can actually be a little bit more run parallel to and not counter to the ideas of science and religion, right? They can actually be two coexisting paths that people travel on. And so when we look at cultures and belief systems objectively through this lens of anthropology, it gives us a little bit more compassion to understand different belief systems. So the idea that Western civilization has engaged in studies of other groups for a long time shows how Western civilization moved to prove that its institutions and achievements were above all unique and superior to other cultures that they encountered. And what this did, as Benedict points out, is that Western civilization and Christianity specifically became the standard. It became normal, and led to the belief that there was or needed to be a uniformity of human behavior across the globe. Of course, this is what Christianity kind of preaches, is that, and most religions, once everybody believes the same, there'll be peace and harmony throughout the world. As we have seen, this has not been the case, because even within Christianity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, there are sects and different groups of people believing in, let's say, Catholicism versus Protestantism. They have different ways of doing things and different morals that they uphold to. So anyway, this expansion of Western civilization, aided by colonization and mercantilism, right? The economy, the global trade, and was actually spurred on by the economic forces, the push-pull factors. This led to this idea of cultural diffusion of white culture, which sanitized other groups and cultures from being taken seriously. The spread and ubiquity of white culture has normalized it and rendered it invisible. Hence, when we look, again, non-judgmentally of what has happened since the pandemic, we see that the protests over the summer were a pushback to this long process of colonization, which basically took one group's culture and just crushed all the others because they had the might and the quote-unquote right of it, right? And so when we unpack why people do the things that they do, and when we address firsthand that this is what our culture did, this is what our discipline did, it's easier and more healthy to move forward and come up with solutions to the various problems that we encounter as human individuals, but also as cultures and as a globe. So in looking and examining anthropology and colonization, we have this idea of othering. So taking one group and having them be the pinnacle of a society or a culture or the globe, and everyone else that falls outside of that becomes othered, right? It's us and them. We are the in-group, and those other people, they're in the out-group, right? Other people. And one of the things I like about Benedict is that she points out that all primitive people, and primitive in this case is referring to first peoples, all primitive people, their words for themselves were the people. So Zuni, Dene, Kiowa, Skarure, it all translates as the people. And then people that fell outside of their group, they were others, right? They had different names for them. The Kwakwutl name for themselves is Kwakwutl, right? People. And other groups of people were named for like the aspect, the cultural customs that they performed. So for instance, Eskimo. Eskimo is what we in non-Kwakwutl cultures think of indigenous people that live in the Northwest, but Eskimo actually just means fish eater. Or for instance, Haudenosaunee is the name for people of the Longhouse, right? What in non-Haudenosaunee people call Iroquois, right? Iroquois actually is a Algonquin derived term meaning snake eater. So that's not the names that people called themselves. It is the names that other people called them and thus were taken up, right? And so it's really important to note that everyone has, regardless of race or culture or religion, everyone has an in-group and everyone has an out-group. And what our modern global society has tackled, or tries to tackle, and has been challenged with, is seeing groups that don't look like us, seeing groups that don't believe like us, noticing the variety of human behaviors and customs as actually being relevant and human beings, right? As equally important as all others, one not being more important than any other group. So trying to break out of this ethnocentric idea and default that human beings continuously fall back on. And so sometimes you have in-groups that are closed and where there's no way that you can become part of them, right? The only way that you become part of this in-group is by being born into it. Outsiders need not apply, right? And it doesn't matter, who you are, what you do, but you can't be within that group. So an example of our kind of modern contemporary society would be like China, right? You cannot be a citizen of the People's Republic of China unless you are ethnically Chinese. So you have to have that bloodline, right? In the United, and that's a closed in group, right? So if you're Malaysian national or Singaporean national, but you are ethnically Chinese, then you can be a People's Republic of China citizen. Now that's different than an American, which totally contrasts that. You can be born here and be an American, or you can be born somewhere else and immigrate here and go through a process that will allow you to become a citizen of the United States. But until then, you are an outsider, right? And every group has, every nation, every cultural group has insiders and outsiders, right? One of the things, the quotes that I really like, and I think really speaks true to this day, is on page 22. Benedict states, "Primitive man never looked out over the world and saw mankind as a group and felt his common cause with his species, whether it was a question of choosing a wife or of taking a head. The first and important distinction was between his own human group and those beyond the pale." So people in our modern world sometimes are nostalgic for looking back at primitive man and saying, oh, that was a time, a simpler time, when we all looked out at others and saw the common unity in human beings. No, that's not the case. We were as prejudiced as we were back then as we are now. The difference is we have tools in our modern toolbox, anthropology being one, is to hopefully be more compassionate and see the humanity within all diversity of life. But we have to actually work at it. And so Benedict points out the distinction between people and the others was not only a matter of religion, but it was also a matter of being less than human for various reasons of appearance, language capability, different economic or political systems. And then there's plenty of, these dichotomies of believer versus heathen, freedman versus slave, rich, poor, formally educated versus street smarts, Democrat versus Republican, right? There's all these divisions which we can create, but we hopefully have tools that can allow us to see the humanity regardless of the distinctions that we point out. So coming a little bit deeper and looking into how this translates, how custom or individual custom and culture balloons even deeper into nationalism and racism, Benedict looked at how studying cultures is important because it is an antidote of nationalism and racial snobbery. Now remember, in 1934, she's in a time where nationalism is getting hot and heavy in Europe, where you had the rise of the fascist parties and the Nazi party within Italy and Germany, respectively. And so she talks about how this idea of studying cultures is applicable to our contemporary society because we have contemporary examples. And again, the reason why I like to use this nearly 100-year-old text is because we still have this nationalism rising up. We still have issues of racism. And so I urge you to keep unpacking when you look at news stories and you see the rhetoric of politicians, to really be critical and see where, like, what is root, like, where are the roots of this tree that they are trying to leaf out and propagate. And again, on page 23, Benedict talks about, quote, "There has never been a time when civilization stood more in need of individuals who are genuinely conditioned behavior of other peoples without fear and recrimination," end quote. And this is why Alfred State requires you to take a course such as this in global perspectives, because in studying different groups of people and unpacking the biases and nationalism and racism that we might hold within our belief systems, we are able to counter it and to meet diversity and variation within a globe with an objective understanding, rather than an ethnocentric perspective of no, I'm right, how I do things is right, and the ideas that you're bringing forth, no, they're from a lesser culture, right? And thus, in another quote, this counters contempt for the alien. It's not the only solution, right? Nature versus nurture is one of the things that anthropologists are constantly looking at. So when we examine Carolus Linnaeus and his taxonomy, which we use today in biology, you have the binomial system, which takes genus and species together, and that is the scientific name. So for instance, Homo sapiens, right? The same wise. That is one of the classifications. Let's say, like, you can have a plant like Cannabis sativa. You have the genus and then you have the species. So what Linnaeus did is he started out, again, he was like an armchair anthropologist. In this case, he was an armchair biologist, where he sat around in his home in Sweden and his lab in Sweden. And he would have things shipped to him from travelers, and then he would compare and contrast them and group them into similar groups. This is a thing that we continuously do today, and we're continuously finding new species, and scientists continue to use Carolus Linnaeus's model to do that. And so in Linnaeus's classification of organic things, he also classified human beings. And there were 4 varieties of human beings, because at this time in the 1700s, when Linnaeus was alive, people had pretty much been, or Europeans had pretty much encountered all the different continents that we know today. And so the 4 varieties of human beings were Americanus, Europaeus, Asiaticus, and Afar. Then there were also classification of feral children who made up a completely separate group from these other four domestic groups. These feral children who were not grown up with or raised with other human beings. Rather, they were raised by wolves, like Romulus and Remus of ancient Roman mythology, you know, the twins who were raised and suckled by wolves, and they formed Rome. Or you also have in our kind of contemporary mythology, what's his name? Tarzan, right? Tarzan was raised by apes, but there's other groups and examples from our contemporary society that have this a human child raised by non-human animals. Anyway, Linnaeus classified them as Homo ferus. And basically what these different groups and different classifications were showing was that humans are not attributed with the same genes of culture, because in most of these cases with the feral children, they showed a lack of capacity for language learning. And I'll post a couple of documentaries for you guys to check out, optional of course. But the other divisions of Americana, you know, Homo Americanus, Europaeus, Asiaticus, and Afro also showed that culture does not necessarily exist in the genes. And so when we look at Benedict's reading on page 27, she points out that, quote, man is not committed in detail by his biological constitution to any particular variety of behavior. Culture is not a biologically transmitted complex. So if a Japanese, an ethnically Japanese person is born in Japan, they will have very different cultural attributes, customs, and attitudes than, let's say, a Japanese person, an ethnically Japanese individual that was born and raised in Brazil. And actually, there are cultural studies where ethnically Japanese nationals were looking for people to import, let's say, into their landscape in order to help them with their work. And they didn't want to take other races in because they were seen as going to be culturally different. And so they looked to the Japanese people that were born in Brazil, because there's quite a large group of Japanese people that were born and raised there for decades and generations. So the Japanese government decided, hey, we're going to take these people. They're ethnically Japanese, they're racially Japanese. We're going to take them and bring them to from Brazil and import them into Japan, because they will be the same. You know, it runs in their blood. Culture runs in their blood. What they unfortunately ended up finding was that these Brazilian Japanese people were actually more Brazilian and Latin in their customs and culture, because although they superficially looked Japanese, they looked Asian, culturally they had been so displaced and dispersed and disconnected that the mores of Japanese culture, which is more reserved, did not follow through. And so there was actually a lot of cultural clash. I will post an article for you guys to review if you would like on that as well. So basically, this understanding that human beings are plastic, right? Their plasticity is what makes us such a strong species, right? our ability as human beings to learn from history as well as experience of non-human animals, and our ways to adapt to new or challenging environments regardless of our biology is what allows us to go through all four corners of the earth, if you will, if earth was a square, and to prosper, and for our different cultures to adapt within individuals, regardless of how we look and how other people in groups versus out groups perceive us to be. And so in studying human diversity, the anthropologist is challenged and challenges the idea of racial purity, because by examining phenotypes, so the way people look, right, their hair, their jaw lines, their skull capacity, in relation to geography, moving from north to south, in Europe, we see a gradation of human variation and biology. So looking at, like, let's say the very top of Sweden and moving down to, let's say, the southern tip of Africa, you'll see a gradation of not only skin color, but maybe jawline, eye color, hair texture, and body morphology, right? The length of our arms, muscle mass, etc., etc. And we'll look more about this when we examine Brace in Race is a Four-Letter Word, who argues that the new maritime technology of the Renaissance enabled people to travel the sea for long distances and long times, where all of a sudden that gradation of human variety gets erased, and you see all of a sudden one group of people that look completely different and like a whole nother species, a whole nother creature than their counterparts, right? And so we'll look over that in more detail at a later date. But this idea of humans becoming localized is a product of inbreeding, right? And geography and technology. So if you have the technology, if you have an airplane where you can travel all over the world and mix and mingle your genes with other groups of people, then you have a more variety of human race, if you will, right? But if, like in the ancient world, most people were confined to their very local 25-mile geography, then the gene pool is going to be much more limited, and so people are going to look more alike, and they're going to think more alike than people of modern times, right? And this aspect of creating customs, and which grows into cultures, binds the local phenotypes and human beings, right? So their ideas, Benedict states that their ideas, their standards they hold common, the symbols that they hold important are the standards of what makes a person human, right? Within that cultural context. So I ask of you, what are the standards in your own culture, your own region, your nation, your religion, and what binds us as citizens and human beings to allow us to see each other as actually human? So Benedict points out that in studying primitive cultures or first peoples cultures, they were seen to anthropologists as being laboratories to study human cultural diversity, right? They were isolated from and being different from Western civilization. And so they offered people that studied cultural history and human beings a chance to see the variety of human innovation in dealing with daily life and social concerns. So daily life, how to feed yourself. Social concerns, who gets to marry whom, and how do we divide power, right? These are struggles that every group of people has to deal with, right? Studying primitive culture in their entirety was thought to be less complex than larger Western industrialized society. which could only be studied in pieces and thus broken up for the purpose into small artificial sections. That's actually where we get this, the study of sociology, right? And sociology was considered to be the study of cultures and society in the West, whereas anthropology was considered to be a study of cultures and people of the non-West, right? And now in contemporary society, we actually see a much larger overlapping of those two disciplines. The major source of difference now is anthropology is based in qualitative studies, so getting the stories of actual individuals within culture and studying different aspects of ceremonies and the minutiae of daily life and ceremonial life, whereas sociology studies more, it's quantitative study. So where you're looking at a lot of data, where you're using surveys and quick things that can be pools of information that are gathered from individuals but are then put into a larger data set. So going back to why anthropologists first started studying primitive cultures is also adults in primitive cultures were thought to contain the cultural traditions of primitive society, whereas in the West, adults were not necessarily seen in those, in that light. And so basically, Benedict argues that there's no reason primitive man should be considered to represent a closer link to ancient man than modern society. And, quote, there is no justification for identifying some one contemporary primitive custom with the original type of human behavior. Human beings are complex regardless of time and space, and there are not necessarily human cultural universals. So when we look at how we believe, our religions, how we restrict marriages, they are not universal. However, there are some universals that all human beings go through, right? We all go through birth. The rituals and customs that might accompany them differ from culture to culture, right? And maybe region to region. How we deal with death is, or death is a universal, right? But how we deal with it is varying, right? And it's infinite in the variety. So, yeah. To conclude, anthropology developed as a way to study human cultures in their context, not just placing them on an evolutionary continuum as to prove, you know, oh, we as a certain group of human beings are unique and therefore we are special. And this will allow us to colonize and exploit other groups of people, their land and their resources, right? And to displace them. Anthropology also developed as a way to counter natural human phenomena of biases and prejudices. And I must say this has been a more recent phenomena of anthropology. And if we look at Franz Boas, who was the, let's say, father of modern day anthropology, he was a German Jew who left his homeland to come to the United States for more open society and practices of not only his religious beliefs, because he was a Jew that had a long history of persecution in Europe with the Jewish pogroms of the 18th century, and if we go back, there's the Spanish Inquisition of the 1400s. So this long history, contentious history that his people suffered allowed him to come to the United States get enthralled with anthropology and become a leader in the discipline and kind of take it from being a kind of race study to being a counter-race study. And then we have romantic notions that return the primitive, to return to the primitive, right? This nostalgic idea that primitive man, first man, just saw everyone as one and human. This kind of idea of a Garden of Eden, right? Does not necessarily solve problems and is not even necessarily true for the past world, and it's not necessarily true for the modern world. And then anthropology and studying a variety of cultures allows us to see the variety of human development, innovation, as well as understand that, oh yeah, there's a lot of cultural variety, but there are some universal human truths, right? And then Benedict's work is still relevant in today's society and within our study of human individuals living within human cultures. Thank you for watching, and I hope this gives you a little bit more perspective on your own life and culture, and a little bit more sensitivity when thinking about other cultures.